the apocalypse. Buildings reduced to ash, society falling apart, and the world thrusted into a new frontier where everything that was once held dear is destroyed. Well, that's not what we're talking about. A quiet apocalypse is not necessarily a new concept, but it is becoming more prominent over the years. Essentially, imagine your traditional apocalypse, but more melancholic. Society is gone, but there isn't some giant bomb or great threat. It's just quiet and empty. Society and people may exist, but the world is, well, far from recognizable. Something's off. Okay, now let's talk about manga. Girls' Last Tour was a manga that centered around cute chibi girls surviving in a post-apocalypse. You might draw a comparison between Made in Abyss, but it's very different. It's better! Girls' Last Tour doesn't rely on monsters and gruesome violence to hammer home the idea of an apocalypse. It achieves that with deafening silence. That silence is scary, right? Both the anime and the manga respectively have long periods of silence where we just see the characters walking, eating, sleeping, or just doing nothing. The author, I'm not going to pronounce that name, is a master at working in these dark post-apocalyptic themes and these cute chibi styles together. To me at least, Girls' Last Tour is a perfect example of a quiet apocalypse where there aren't really any monsters and the humans they encounter are relatively peaceful or just too depressed to do anything. It's all about basic survival, eating, finding water, and having a shelter. Living life in this quiet seems a million times more pressing than those weird action YA novel movies. Those were a fucking mess. Now you might be wondering, what does Shimeji Simulation have to do with this quiet apocalypse? Well, I think it's the author's best work and also a prime example of my favorite version of this type of trope, because it's fucking insane. Shimeji Simulation stars Shimeji, a girl who grows mushrooms on her head, and Majima, a girl with an egg on her head. There's a little bit more backstory to this, but it's really not that important until we get farther in, so. From the beginning of chapter 1, things already look a little bit off. She's walking to school in what looks like to be the countryside, but why are there giant high-rise buildings in the countryside? The following chapters expand on this Nichijou-esque type of slice of life. The backgrounds are strange and empty. Shimeji and Majime, while not exactly friends, join the hole digging club, and that devolves into a talk about existentialism. This manga gets very introspective, and the main topic that is consistent throughout the manga is the nature of apathy and proactiveness. Shimeji never begins or ends anything, but Majime is the embodiment of positivity and proactiveness. It's the perfect balance. The characters in this manga aren't necessarily characters, but vehicles to drive home the messages. But the manga wouldn't be interesting if it was just that. There's a story, albeit a little hard to follow, and even to read at times. Things get pretty interesting when Shimeji's sister comes into the picture. She is both the voice of reason and also, ironically, the catalyst for chaos. Her job as a scientist puts our little characters into these Evangelion scenarios that just get almost acid trippy. Chapter 19 introduces us to her sister's strange inventions and shows off even more of this wacky, absurdist world. Her sister has made a perpetual motion machine, because if you didn't know, that's impossible, at least currently. A drill that just keeps on drilling to the center of whatever, and a fish machine. Yeah, it gets weird. The following chapter sees them fall down that said hole, and can I just say, it's a beautiful chapter, you should read it yourself, but spoilers. It takes them to this serene, peaceful beach that is an allegory for either limbo or heaven. I mean, everything in here could be a limbo or heaven allegory, it doesn't really matter. They meet this strange girl that has some sort of godlike powers, that's not really explained, and gives the teacher a wand that lets her create donuts and weird sculptures. And this simple act of creation moves the teacher to tears. Let's flash back a little bit. The teacher who's overseeing the club usually digs holes, which is destruction. She is removing something from the earth, and she excessively drinks to not feel anything. But in this one moment of creation, she is moved by how rewarding and good it feels to actually create something. This simplicity and strange way of rounding out a character is just fantastic. It's also peak surrealism because she's not really building anything useful, she's just playing in the sand. The following chapters get even crazier. The school is just inverted for some reason, the world bends and defies the laws of physics, and the rest of the class just acts like it's normal. Water begins to lose gravity and begin to float. Some chapters don't don't really have a deep message and are just weird for the sake of it, but some are very profound in what they want to say. Chapter 26 is my personal favorite as it further develops the relationship between Shimeji and Majime. In this chapter, the world becomes invisible apart from their bodies, and after some hijinks, they enter this weird dimension with square alien homes, and then they come back like it's nothing. But throughout the chapter, Majime holds Shimeji's hand and keeps holding it throughout, and in some nice character development for Shimeji, she doesn't mind it at all. Instead, she takes proactive care to hold her hand back. Instead of apathy, she responds to emotions. Things go well for a little bit until... Chapter 40, without getting into too much spoilers, is when the world gets turned upside down. And not literally, things just become truly alien, so I guess you can take that literally. I don't even know at this point. So Shimeji's sister has a doppelganger who, instead of creating, resets. And instead of Shimeji's real sister catching and stopping her, the world suffers from a reset, and everyone and everything gets changed. This might seem like it came out of nowhere, but what's cool about this manga is how the apocalypse builds. Again, the quiet apocalypse. Every chapter things get stranger and stranger, so even as we are watching this world descend into madness, we are already lulled into this sense of familiarity, even if the world was radically different from what it was in the beginning. Instead of Shimeji going to school in this admittedly strange atmosphere, she's now getting into these world-ending scenarios. No one reacts, it just happens. From this point on, things get very dark. Themes of intimacy and even become central points for this manga. So that's my warning to you. If you are sensitive to this type of stuff, I don't recommend going beyond this point. In chapter 43, Shimeji and Majima, after exploring for a little while, find the teacher and give me a second because this is going to be tough to explain. So the teacher has presumably been creating donuts in space for a long time, or so we think. But it's so much so that she forgets about Shimeji and Majima completely. Shimeji comes to the realization that everything in this world is symbolic, and feeling and thoughts somehow can become reality. The teacher, after fulfilling her purpose, decides to try to by what's her purpose? Creating donuts.
There's also the fact that they are currently sitting inside of a painting. I guess it's a pocket dimension created by Sumida-chan, a relatively minor character that paints different realities that the teacher lives through. So, the donut painting was hers, and even the self-deletion painting was one of her many pieces. This doesn't mean the entire world is her art, but that her paintings contain different realities that only exist within the piece. The teacher doesn't really seem to mind, and in fact enjoys the different scenarios she's put in.
After this chapter, things become a bit more, I guess, sad. Shimeji and Majima find a house and decide to stay in it for presumably days, months, years. Eventually, things become a blur and Shimeji can't even count the days. There is no sunrise or sunset. It's just that one house. It all seems fine and dandy and they're doing okay, but things get kind of strange. Majime initiates intimacy with Shimeji after she decides to comfort her. It's a rare moment of peace for a panel where it's just the two of them staring out into the vastness of a wasteland and weirdness. But it's undercut with this almost forced shift into something more inappropriate. While not entirely against it, Shimeji begins to feel like she might disappear into nothingness. And she does begin to fade as Majime and her body start to fuse and become one. She runs away outside of the house into the darkness and Majime is gone. The house is gone. She is completely alone. I think the house represents security, but also complacency and the nature of relationships. Majima and Shimeji did nothing in the house but procrastinate, but the moment that they decide to do something that was out of both of their own comfort zones, they begin to change and morph unnaturally, and the house was destroyed once they both left this complacency. You could also interpret this as the nature of getting into a relationship and becoming one with your partner. That's a common phrase, and maybe Shimeji is afraid to get close to someone like that. Her view on relationships is morphed and she can't become one with a person. She's not comfortable with becoming that. The following chapters follow Shimeji alone, floating through an endless space of nothing and everything. She meets Yomikawa, a book nerd who has collected all the books that humanity has ever written, and she begins to speak with Shimeji about the nature of creation, both religiously and scientifically. Yoshikawa sort of explains the world they are living in is an actual fake world. You see, after an epidemic which caused a massive world war, humanity was forced to create a computer to put their consciousness in to live in peace. The computer is currently floating through space and contains the city and, well, space they are living in currently. Great, we finally get an explanation, and, well, that's not it. You see, that would be too easy. No. Yomikawa explains that their world could have been created by a number of factors. It could have been the primordial soup, genetic evolution, it could have been this computer sci-fi thing. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter, right? Every answer exists in right and wrong. This is just a side tangent, but I feel like trying to explain this world using the simulation theory is going against what the author wants you to think, in my opinion. To me, I see Yomikawa as a self-insert of the author. She's telling us that there are multiple explanations that'll never be satisfactory on how this world is created. You don't have to necessarily take it at face value. You definitely can, but she's just giving you multiple options of what to think. It might seem a bit lazy to you, and I do agree that that writing method can get a bit tiresome after seeing it so many times in modern media, but I feel like with this surrealist take on the sci-fi and fantasy genre, I guess, she is doing something wholly unique to this experience. It's not as bleak as Girls Last Tour or realistic as Girls Last Tour, because that actually gave you some sort of meat to try to piece together the world. This one gives you nothing, so you can make up your own interpretation of what the hell is going on. The manga then shifts into a book. Literally, it's just writing, and most of it references famous literature like Edgar Allan Poe, the Divine Comedy, and even the Iliad, but all of it is just mashed into a collective mush that in the end doesn't really read like much of anything. Shimeji begins to think about Majime, and guilt hits her, and she fears that Majime has disappeared without her. Her mind is rushed with different ideas, thoughts, and sentences, memories that existed or never existed at all, realities that could or could not have been, and people that she remembers, but she also forgot. Everything all at once hits her, and she begins to cry. The narrator shifts into what I could only assume is Majime, as she wishes that in the future, both of them can meet again somehow. The narrator is not Shimeji. You could interpret it like me, that it's Majime. You could interpret it as the audience reading to her. You could even say it's the author talking to Shimeji. But there is one through line. Shimeji is afraid of being alone. The act of crying, the act of caring, is completely opposite to her apathetic state in the beginning chapters. This manga is a paradox to me. On the one hand, it can mean so much. There are messages about apathy and the nature of empathy, love, and happiness, but there's also the possibility that this manga simply exists to be strange and weird, and the through line of the themes is the point. It's just weirdness for the sake of that. But I can't shake the feeling that this manga is so much more. It feels like an extension of Girls Last Tour. While the ending of that manga felt unsatisfying and anticlimactic for a reason, this manga feels like it can go somewhere more symbolic. The story, the characters, hell, the art have become part of this greater, wider message that maybe we'll see with the ending. But until then, we have to wait, unfortunately. And we'll wake up tomorrow and eat breakfast, jog, or do nothing at all. But most importantly, we'll live. We'll be okay. See you next time, boys.